Okay, what do you say, Rob? Shall we get started?
I think we should go ahead and get started. Yeah.
Hey.
All right.
All right, so I'll get us started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Casey with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District. Thanks for joining us for our second workshop in a two-part workshop series discussing soil health in urban agriculture. Tonight's workshop is going to focus on soil sampling and exposure prevention. And before we get started with the main part of the workshop, we wanted to get a sense of who we have in attendance and who attended our first workshop. So we'll start off with a short poll. So let me get that going. Okay, so the first question: in which county you are growing food? And the second, which best describes you, whether you're an urban farmer, community gardener. And the third, if you were in attendance in the first, just so we have a sense of how many people were here last time. I'll give you all a little bit more time to respond.
All righty.
Okay, and I'm gonna end the polling. So looks like 45% from San Francisco, and then with a significant amount from San Mateo and Alameda counties. And the majority of participants describe themselves as urban farmers, with some community gardeners, curious community participants, and other. And about 36% were in attendance last time. So thank you for doing that. Just gives us a sense of who's here. Thanks for those of you who have introduced yourselves in the chat. If you have just joined us, you can add your name and where you're growing and any organization you're affiliated with. And then I also wanted to introduce Rob Benetton, who will be presenting a bulk of the workshop tonight. Rob is coming from UC Cooperative Extension and is one of the Bay Area Urban Ag advisors who I assume many of you have met or interacted with at some point. So I'm gonna move us along and give us a brief overview of what we have in store for tonight. For those of you who were in attendance at our last workshop, some of this will be a repeat, but it will be brief. So I'll give a brief intro about resource conservation districts, and then we'll talk a little bit about how the RCD can help and provide support to urban ag producers in San Francisco and San Mateo counties. I'll go into a little bit about soil health practices, some of what Rob touched on last time. We'll just talk a little bit more about that. And then Rob will jump into the main part of our presentation tonight about soil sampling and exposure prevention in urban ag. And like Rob said, then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to type your questions in the chat as we go, and I'll go through them at the end. And we can also unmute you at the end if you would prefer to actually ask the question with your voice so we can unmute you. Let's see, we do have a post-workshop survey. I'll share the link for that at the end. It's helpful for our information if you can fill that out just to see how we did and how we can improve. And then I'll also share a link to a resources page. It's the same one I shared last time, but we've added some resources that are specific to tonight's workshop. So with that, a little bit about the Resource Conservation District, especially for those of you who haven't heard of an RCD before. So the RCD was started by farmers in 1939 as the Soil Conservation District in response to the Dust Bowl. And today there are about 100 RCDs throughout California, and they exist in the all across the United States as well. We exist in close partnership with our federal partner, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. And we started working with farmers and ranchers way back when and have since expanded to work with all landowners and land managers. And a little bit about what we do and how we do it. So the RCD is a special district, just like a fire district or a water district. So we are local government, but we are not part of the county government, although we partner with the county a lot. And we operate like a nonprofit. So a lot of our funds come from grants that we secure. And we exist to help people help the land. And we do that in 3 ways. One, by providing technical assistance, which is free and non-regulatory. The second is by doing conservation projects. So we help build ponds for farmers and ranchers so they can have water security. We help farmers plant cover crop and a whole wide variety of different projects. And then the third is by conducting outreach and education, so much like what we're doing here tonight. And then this just gives an overview of our program areas. So although we started as a soil conservation district, our scope has expanded to encompass all natural resource areas. And there's a lot more information about the RCD. I'm not gonna bore you tonight. Well, not bore you, but I'm not gonna spend too much more time talking about the RCD. But if you are interested in learning more, please check out our website. I'll put it in the chat in a little bit. And feel free to email me if you have any questions about the RCD. So now how the RCD can help you all, the urban ag producers. So through funding from the National Association of Conservation Districts, we were able to put on this workshop and the workshop a few weeks ago. And we're also able to offer assistance to our urban ag growers. So some of the ways we can help, offering workshops like the ones you all are participating in, and then providing technical and financial assistance. So if you have questions about your natural resources at your urban farm, anything pertaining to water, soil, wildlife habitat, we can set up a site visit and help support your needs. And occasionally we have funding to support conservation projects like those that build soil health or establish compost setups or build pollinator habitat, or many others. And if we can't help you, we'll connect you with someone who can. So we have funding from the NACD, the National Association of Conservation Districts, to put on these workshops and also to help with technical assistance pertaining to soil health. So we can help with soil health assessments, soil testing, implementing soil health practices and more. So if any of that is of interest to you or you want to learn more, please reach out. So now I am just going to do a brief review of some of the soil health practices Rob discussed in our first workshop 2 weeks ago. And let's see, so I'll start with compost, which is a pretty common agricultural practice. A lot of you are probably very familiar, but just wanted to do a little overview of how it can provide or improve soil health, and then some of the co-benefits. So compost can be made up of livestock manure, yard trimmings, food waste, and leaf litter, and it decomposes into a soil amendment. Very, very simple definition. And when applied to and incorporated into soil, compost can provide a lot of benefits to soil health, some of which Rob discussed in the last workshop. So it helps with a lot of the supplying macro and micronutrients to soil and plants, improving soil structure and porosity. So there's airspace and water can move through soil, can help stimulate root growth, reduce erosion, improve water and nutrient holding capacity and water infiltration, and many others. So next I wanted to talk about cover crop. Planting cover crop is essentially planting various crop varieties to help build soil and help it recover from past tillage or crop production. And there's a really nice example here. There's some peas and vetch and oats and maybe some bell beans in the back. And often you see cover crop growing in like gardens or farms that are growing directly in the ground, but it's also a practice you can utilize in raised beds. And some of those cover crops that I mentioned, the legumes, the peas, the vetch, the bell beans, have the ability to fix nitrogen, which is really useful. As we know, nitrogen is one of the main nutrients that plants need. So that's, and then cover crops also help with water infiltration. They're most often planted in the fall, but can also be planted in the summer. They add organic matter, reduce wind and water erosion, and suppress excessive weed pressure. And one other thing I just wanted to add is when they're planted in the fall, oftentimes that's, when fields are left fallow or you have a bed that you aren't going to plant into. And with all the rain coming in the winter, hopefully, having a cover crop planted helps prevent compaction from the rain when it directly hits the soil and then provides all these other benefits. So next is mulch. So using organic materials to cover and protect the soil and reduce soil dust. I think one of, or two of the most common materials we see being used as mulch are wood chips or straw. And this is an example in this picture of what looks like some straw in and around the plants. It helps the soil retain water, which is really important right now, especially being in a drought. And it can add organic matter as the mulch decomposes over time, and can also prevent weeds from germinating by blocking out the sun. And another important soil health practice is sort of a broad one, but reducing soil disturbance. So two practices that seem to fit under that are no or reduced till systems, which might be more attributed to larger scale ag when you have tractors and a lot of tillage, but it can also be implemented in urban ag systems. So that might be using permanent beds where you're just disturbing the soil less and decreasing the amount that you turn a bed over or work the soil. And that can just disturbs like the fungal and microbial communities less. Soil structure isn't disturbed. And then the other one is planting perennials as opposed to annuals. So you're just leaving plants in the ground longer that have the ability to grow more than just 1 year and can survive through the winter. And those have many benefits. One big one is stabilizing the soil and preventing soil erosion. And then any of the leaves that drop from those plants can provide a mulch and eventually add organic matter to the soil. And then they, of course, provide many co-benefits. And lastly, before Rob jumps into his part of the presentation, I just wanted to kind of talk more broadly about soil sampling and why you might want to sample and test your soil. There are many reasons why, and it isn't always necessary for every situation. So a few examples of why you might is maybe if you're noticing crops that aren't doing very well and you can't figure out what's going on, or you're planting in a new site or planting directly into the ground for the first time. And also if you're trying to figure out like what the pH is of your soil, what amount of macro or micronutrients are in your soil, or what % organic matter you have, those things you generally need to do a soil test for to figure out what the content is in your soil. And that information can help guide and inform decision-making about your nutrient management and whether you need to add soil amendments. So for instance, if you want to grow a crop that is, needs a sort of higher or lower pH, like blueberries, it's helpful to know what your pH is so that you can know whether you need to make any additions to your soil that's better for that crop. And then another reason why is assessing for any potential soil contaminants. And that, I think, is a nice segue to Rob's presentation. So I am going to stop sharing and hand it over.
All right, I'm going to share screen. There we go. Give me a, oops, it's this one. Thanks. Okay. All right. So good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Benetton. I work with UC Cooperative Extension in urban agriculture, and I'm so glad you all made it today. And I hope everything is going well with you and your families. At this time, you know, we're going into fire season, and we've been in COVID for a year or so. So just wanted to wish you all the best from the get-go. Thanks so much. So I work with UCANR, the Division of Ag and Natural Resources. We have 5 strategic initiatives, all of which touch on food and farming in some way, shape, or form. So sustainable food systems, healthy families and communities, the most important thing. Endemic and invasive pests and diseases, sustainable natural ecosystems, and then water quality, quantity, and security. Of course, without water, we wouldn't be able to be surviving and hydrating, right? So UC Cooperative Extension is part of both a national and locally funded and supported system. We link education and research through the land grant universities with county residents, and specialists are based on some of the campuses, not all of the UC campuses. And advisors are generally county-based and regionally focused. And the main idea here with Cooperative Extension is to work with community to use scientific research to meet community needs and help solve local problems. So we collaborate with our community residents, identify critical emerging community needs in ag sciences, nutrition, youth development, and then develop research and educational programs to solve problems. We're also, just so you know, we're also not just part of the university, but we're also part of the county organizational structure as well. So we're also directly in connection with local county agencies and work collaboratively with them to support county goals like sustainability, for example. And so just some of the programs you may or may not be familiar with in Cooperative Extension include the Urban Ag program, or Urban Ag and Food Systems that I run, 4-H youth development, a couple of nutritional education federally funded programs, integrated pest management, rangelands, crops, ag crops, and then the Master Gardener program, many of whom on this call, this Zoom today, are Master Gardeners. So the goal of today's webinar / workshop, I wish we could do this in person. I always love interfacing with folks in person, talking about soils. I find soils fascinating myself, is to understand soil quality, really to assess site risk and manage soils to grow food, farm, and fam safely, right? Ultimately, we want to have safe soils so that we can get bountiful blossoms and plentiful harvests, right? So the understanding, the need, the objective is really to provide some soil testing and best practice guidance to really be able to make some informed decisions and reduce the risk of potential soil contaminants. Not every soil has contaminants by any means, but in urban areas, we do need to be careful and be safe. So things to think about. So why should you care about your soil, right? That's ultimately the bottom line. That's why we're here, right? This conversation is very much about safe growing practices in the process of growing our produce, our vegetable crops and our fruit crops. So think about the interconnectivity of plants with soil, right? And those interactions and how they relate, right? How actually ultimately the plants grow in the soil and or fruit and flower and elongate and grow and survive. So soils sometimes can be easy to improve and at other times have more challenging situations. In urban areas where many of our soils are no longer the original natural soil that developed over millions of years, many of those soils were built upon or moved in the process of urbanization and the development of cities and towns. around our urban areas. And often it's important to think about plants in terms of how they grow best, right? We want to grow our crops in the proper culture for those particular plants and how they grow best. And when thinking about plant cultures, we think about the kinds of nutrients the plants, the fruits and vegetable plants actually need, the structure of the soil, the composition, and the pH. We often say it's better to not guess what's in the soil, but to test. So I often, when we're in person, I ask everybody to repeat, don't guess, but test. And so some soils, like I said, are harder to improve. If there's a site history that may have had some level of potential impacts on the soil that could have included contaminants, it's an investigative process to actually figure that out. Soil quality can affect human and plant health, and this very much gets into the conversation of what is managing risk and also preventing exposure when you're thinking about soils and soils that may have some level of contaminants in them. We want to think about risk management even in the process of getting the soil sampled and tested. So when thinking about soils, there are home-based tests you can do. Sometimes you can buy pH tests and certain kinds of lead tests, although not necessarily soil-based ones, from a hardware store or nursery. And then you can get lab tests done, right? By sending in a soil sample to your local lab. These home-based tests are basically do-it-yourself home tests, right? They provide some basic level of information, and it's sort of very general and not always very generalizable across your entire site, right? And some sites vary, right? Some urban farm or community garden or school garden or faith-based or therapeutic sites may be small in acreage, and others might be much larger. Some may be on parks properties, and even, for example, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission properties, and be actually acreage in size, right? In the East Bay, we have on San Francisco Public Utilities Commission property, we have the Sonol Ag Park that's about 8 or 10 acres. So there are varying sizes to think about in this conversation. And lab tests compared to do-it-yourself home tests provide a much greater level of reliability and precision in terms of getting more accurate, more refined, more precise test results. So in thinking about soil contaminants, you want to think about where could soil contaminants be a concern? Where are the possibilities, right? And without testing, we won't really know, but there are, through the course of this webinar, examples that will be shared of the kinds of practices that one can undertake in the growing process, in actually cultivating fruits and vegetables, and even managing poultry, for example, that can help prevent and cut off pathways for exposure if there are contaminants in the soil. So agricultural lands are one example where if they were historically cultivated lands, where there could be potentials for soil contaminants, historically often from pesticides. Many of the pesticides of the past that aren't necessarily sold today did have certain levels of heavy metals in them, as one example. Arsenic, lead, those kinds, right? And they ultimately were meant to inhibit plant growth, but in the long run, long-term exposure can affect human health as well, right? And that's when we also get into the conversation about risk management in terms of like frequency of exposure times the concentration of the kind of contaminant we're talking about, and also duration over time, right? How long over time have you been exposed? And in residential properties, we also start to think about, okay, what kind of contaminants could be in our ambient environment, right? And to what degree could they be below a threshold level that's allowable for human or plant health, or above threshold levels? And then in urban ag and community garden kinds of sites, right? Sites that may have been something else previously, like the others, all of this is based on the site history, right? The specific land uses that came before their current use. So if you're on a school property, you know, was it a school property 50 years ago? Was it residential? Was it industrial? Was it some kind of other land use that may have included potentials for contaminants? And related to that site history, there's a smorgasbord of potential risks, but it's important to not get overly worried until there's actually a need to, right? It's important to do your homework, to actually investigate the site history and think about what you might need to test for, right? And that's what that conversation about the site history is all about. So here's some common soil contaminant sources. Those who were around in the 70s probably remember the Get the Lead Out movement, when there was still gas that had lead in it. And then paint, exterior paint on homes, residential properties, and then actually piping, interior piping would sometimes have lead in it as well. In addition to that, because lead was in gasoline, high traffic areas, areas that are historical highway pathways, and properties that are near them had the potential to have some level of amounts of contaminants, especially heavy metals like lead in particular. Cadmium from tires, for example, is another one. And so high traffic areas have the potential to have lead and zinc. And then you see that second line there, it says PAHs. PAHs are a fun short acronym that's a way to refer to what are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Anybody ever see Mary Poppins, you know, where she sings that really, really long word? Well, that's what sometimes polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons reminds me of, right? Say polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons 3 times fast. I stumbled myself, right? And it's a fancy way of saying petrochemicals, right? Chemicals that are oil or gas or petroleum-based products that have large amount of hydrocarbons in them. Another example of contaminants include treated lumber, right? Historically, treated lumber with preservatives in them would have arsenic, cadmium, or copper. You sometimes would see CCA, copper chromate, might be CCR. Anyhow, and then burning waste, right? There is a history in this country and in other parts of the world of taking our waste, and instead of burying it in landfills or sending it to the waste management company that picks up our residential trash, of actually burning it. When plastics and metals treated with other materials and cover surface kind of paints, for example, are burned, you have the potential for releasing polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and dioxins and furans, for example, which aren't listed there, into the air. And over time, these can end up in other places in our environment. Manures. We don't often think about manures having potential for contaminants, but those croplands that I talked about previously in the earlier part, those agricultural lands that were historically sprayed, if those sprays had heavy metals in them, and then were later converted to rangelands instead of orchards, for example, then the potential for small amounts of consumption of crops that may have uptaken some of those small amounts of heavy metals is there. It may be small amounts that is not of a concern. So again, not to worry, but be aware, right? Coal ash is another one, molybdenum. Can everybody say molybdenum? And then sewage sludge. Oftentimes sewage sludge from our sewage treatment plants are shipped to other parts of the country where they're grown on agronomic crop fields, often for silage, for cattle in range situations. And so the potential for their replication in the ambient environment is higher. petrochemicals, whenever you see that ENE, benzene, toluene, xylene, right? That's a reference to a double carbon bond in organic compounds. And all petrochemicals, and you and I are all organic, right? We all are or were something that came from a natural substance, something that was part of a living organism at one point, right? But that ENE, that represents that double carbon bond in the petrochemical compound structure, and actually is a reference to the level of strength of that petrochemical in the ambient environment. And so a lot of the kinds of chemicals that are associated with automobiles, right, are petroleum products, solvents, and even lead, all of which have the potential to be small sources of contaminants in the ambient environment. And then the site use itself, how was the site used? Was it a dry cleaner, a gas station? Was it a junkyard where various kinds of materials went through and were redistributed? Is it a 3 a.m. dumping ground where anything from that local uninsured contractor or unlicensed contractor who doesn't want to pay a tipping fee might be dropping off materials randomly on the side of the road? And then we already talked about pesticides, right? So where are soil contaminants a concern, specifically in urban areas? Think about it, and how are they a concern, right? Contaminants can inhibit plant growth, they can affect human health, and they persist in the soils long-term, often without us knowing about it, right? We can't necessarily see soil contaminants, yet they may be there, and they may be there in very small amounts or slightly larger amounts, and you won't know unless you get your soil tested, right? So that's really one of the key messages here is don't guess, but actually get your soil tested, get it tested. Now, this part of the dialogue in the webinar here really talks out about lead, but I want to emphasize, ask yourself, right, is lead the only heavy metal, right? In reality, lead is the most studied, most knowledge built upon, researched of the heavy metals globally, but in fact, lead is part of a suite, a family of heavy metals. They include others: mercury, cadmium, arsenic, zinc, nickel, vanadium, barium. It goes on and on. But lead is a good example, and many of the practices we use to stay free from lead in terms of exposure pathways are also those you would also follow to prevent exposure to other heavy metals if they're present in our soils or our ambient environments. So think about old homes, right? Old homes that were built before 1978, 1979, when lead was outlawed in exterior paint and in gasoline. They may chip. They may chip in particular in terms of where the lead paint was applied. That chipping can eventually over time become lead dust in and outside of homes. And sometimes older homes have a tough time, opening and closing windows. You have to put a little bit of effort, a little extra muscle into that process. And that's often where small amounts of lead become lead dust into the air because of that chipping of that friction of opening and closing windows that are tight, right? So think of lead dust in homes in terms of prep work and friction at windows, and in terms of when, if you know folks in the home management and construction industry, are they taking care of themselves in terms of being safe? Think of bare soils underneath the outer perimeter of those homes, right? Often those spaces that are also the walked upon by the most, whether there are pets or our kids or our family members, might be the place where you put the barbecue, so the soil is compacted there, right? So that bare soil, uncovered, right, has the potential to be a place where soil dust that could have small amounts of lead in it actually accumulates, right? And also think about how you might track lead dust on soil particles into your home, right? Are you wearing boots or slippers? Are you walking around barefoot and then walking inside your home, possibly where there may be a rug, carpet, right? Or multiple carpets? Do you have young children that are playing in the garden and they're the house in which you're living or next door to perhaps is an older building, older residential structure built before 1978. So are you tracking soil dust into your home, right? Do you have a pet that's digging holes in that soil and then going into your home and rolling around on the carpet, right? Where does your pet sleep? So things to think about. Think about the ecology of your ambient environment and your residential situation and your growing space, right? Urban farming is the production, marketing, distribution of food in and around cities, but it also includes situations of urbanization where you're potentially getting some of these compounds into your ambient environment, right? So pathways, right? Think about the pathways of exposure in terms of your food growing processes. When you're working with soil, when you're working with your plants in your garden space, especially if it was a pre-1978 home situation or on an urban farm that may have had another use beforehand, are you working with bare hands? Are you eating straight from the garden after a windy night when the soils may have blown around a bit because they're uncovered, or there's a lack of moisture in the air because we're in a drought season, right? Think about hands contaminated with leaded paint if you're working on an older home, and or if you're working in the garden space on very low level soils in terms of contaminants, if there are any, and you're actually taking some food and putting it in your mouth or smoking a cigarette and putting it near your face, right? The potential for inhaling small amounts is there. It's a cumulative thing, so it may not be a risk at all, but maybe something to think about, right? So eating lead-containing soil or paint dust on unwashed produce that has uptaken lead could be a concern, something to think about. So how are we exposed? What are the effects of exposure in terms of our human health, right? Lead is just one example again, but in thinking about lead can affect brain development, interfere with our kidney health, our iron deficiencies may be the result, behavior can be an issue, calcium uptake can be a concern when there's lead in the ambient environment, and children and seniors are those most at risk, and also pregnant mothers as well. You know, the fetus is still developing and the potential for the lead to cross the placenta is there to some degree, but only if it's there in your ambient environment. So think about exposure pathways, right? What are the ways that you could potentially get exposed to heavy metals such as lead in your ambient environment or other contaminants, right? Again, based on the historical land use. Soil dust ingestion is one way, right? If there is soil dust with lead attaching to the soil particles and that's blowing around, skin and eye contact and inhalation, right? The barefoot situation, right? Where the kids or the pets or you are walking in. And then again, who's impacted, right? Kids, seniors, and it's going to be based on the level of potential contaminant concentrations that may exist. So things to think about. Again, in thinking about exposure pathways, think about the plants you're working with. What are the kinds of plants you're growing? Are they root and leafy green vegetable crops? Are they fruit trees that are woody? Plants that uptake heavy metals through roots? Ultimately, you would need to know that more through lab tests. The same is true also as well with fruity crops and woody fruit trees like stone crops, for example. But there's plant contaminant uptake in terms of exposure pathways through roots, and then there's topical exposure where, again, soil dust has the potential to land on the outside of your plants or on the outside of your fruiting crops, right? Think about stone crops. Some of those stone crops, like peaches and nectarines, are fuzzy, right? They're hairy, and they are more likely to catch some of the soil dust that could have small amounts of lead attached to it, right? Don't forget to wash your vegetables. Don't forget to think about the kinds of crops you're growing in the kinds of soils you have, and once they've gotten tested, understanding what the nuances and dynamics of that is, right? If you've got leafy greens or root crops that are at or near threshold levels, actually growing those crops in those levels of thresholds will actually be a potentially greater level of risk, whereas fruit trees are unlikely to take up, fruit trees and shrubs are unlikely to take up from the soil because of their lignified root membranes, the potential contaminants that could be in there, especially at low levels, right? But they could receive soil dust again. So don't forget to think about that. And this is where your observation skills are really, really important, right? Look at your crops, observe your crops on a regular basis. And you do this for food safety reasons too. You also do it for plant health generally, right? The good farmer or gardener, the good food grower observes regularly. At least take a walk around and scout your site once a week. Check for signs of soil dust, check for signs of little critters that are potentially crawling around at the base of your plants and also have potential to introduce food safety concerns as well. That's almost like a whole other topic, but it is something to keep watch for too. And then soil contaminants are not visible to the naked eye, so you really will need to get soils tested for and get your lab test results back. If some level of contaminants are found, how do you manage the soils, right? If they're low level threshold, you can use some best practices. That's a lot of what the rest of this webinar is about. So again, don't forget to get your soils tested. You are your best researcher, neighbor, community educator, investigator, and really a person who's going to do the homework on what your site history was like in the past. Based on your site history, you can get a greater level of understanding of what potential risks are in terms of your own soil safety, right? And soil safety is what it's all about. But it's also a way to save you some pocket money, right? Everybody take out that dollar from your pocket, right? And when we're in person, I also often joke, all right, everybody give me some of your money, right? Because the reality is if you are testing for heavy metals and there's no suggested evidence that says that some of those heavy metals actually were present on the site, you could be actually spending your money on something you really don't need to. So it's a way to doing your site history homework, using the internet as a resource, using Sanborn Maps from your local library is another way to find out some of your site history. We're going to get into that in a little bit. So if you're importing soils, right, you're going to build up raised beds. You're going to buy what are called OMRI, or Organic Materials Review Institute soils. You're going to test your soils in California to confirm, for example, at the very minimum test for lead, that your soils are below 80 parts per million. And there are threshold levels for all of the heavy metals, and some of the resources that Casey's going to share actually indicate what those are. And even recently, there have been some reductions in what those threshold levels are. The other piece, though, is that some of the science is still being worked on. Until very, very recently, under the Trump era, the threshold level for lead by the EPA was 400 parts per million. That's the federal government, the national threshold. But the local threshold has been 80 parts per million in California for a long time. But the thing to keep in mind is that those thresholds are based on residential soil cleanup objectives, SCOs. They are not necessarily based on your soil or plant health to the degree we'd like them to be. And so some of this work is still going on, but there was a recent reduction from 400 parts per million with the EPA and the Food and Drug Administration to 200 parts per million for lead in particular. So keep that in mind, that some of this is an ongoing conversation. Wear gloves and practices that ultimately practice efforts that keep you safe, right? You want to practice good hygiene, wash your hands before you eat your crops if there's soil contaminant concerns in the soil, right? And think about wearing boots and maybe even having a boot brush if you're walking into your home environment or a post-harvest handling space where you're prepping your vegetables for market, for example, and keeping the soil dust out as much as possible. Don't let kids garden or play in soils that are greater than 80 parts per million in California or 200 parts per million in any other part of the country. No, just keep in mind that these thresholds are a little bit different and some of this work is still going on. But 80 parts per million is the threshold last checked in California. Some other practices, I talked a little bit about raised beds, right? If you're really concerned about your soils because your test results suggest that you do have lead or other contaminants above the threshold levels, you want to not disturb the soil at all. You want to build up, right? That's the first of the best practices. You want to import clean soils to work with and make and use your own compost. Good soil management takes a long amount of time. It doesn't happen overnight. It can take years. So keep that in mind, but building up can be a good starting point. You want to regularly amend your soil with compost or finished humus. Compost can bind soil contaminants. Composts that are high in phosphorus in particular, which tend to be manure-based composts, can permanently bind several of the heavy metals, according to the research that's been done. And this research is ongoing, but there's a decent volume of articles out there that suggest that this is the case for arsenic, cadmium, and lead, to say the least, as well as several of the others. There's some evidence towards that. Also, adding compost on a regular basis to your soil when you're planting or harvesting can also dilute potential contaminants that may be in the ambient environment as well. Mulching is a key thing to consider as well as a practice, right? Mulching can help prevent airborne soil dust that can splash up to the underside of the leaves. You ever grow deeply veined leafy greens like Savoy cabbage or Swiss chard or kale or collard greens or spinach, and you look at the underside of the leaves and they've got small amounts of a film of soil particles on them? That's potentially from the wind from soil dust, but it could be upsplash from when you're irrigating, right? We're in California, so water is a resource that we want to conserve as much as possible. So it goes with good irrigation and water management practices to water through subsurface irrigation and not use sprinklers or overhead hose watering processes, right? All of that can prevent upsplash onto the underside of the leaves. That's a good practice. And mulching will do that as well by covering the soil and keeping soil dust down. And then that subsurface irrigating, right? That'll prevent the spreading of soil particles as well. You want to manage your pH. Think about testing your soil pH about once a year or so. You know, I shared in the first workshop that soil pH also affects your ability of your plants, your crops to uptake soil nutrients. And some crops like it a slightly acidic, like blueberries, and others like it a little bit alkaline, like goji berries. We talked about that. But as on the whole, if your plants remain healthy and if your soils are healthy, your crops will be healthy, and what you grow from them and consume from them will also help you to be healthy as well. That old saying, you are what you eat, really does apply. You want to promote good drainage. So think about this, right? If you're growing food on a slope, the potential for soil contaminants, if there are any, and you know, some parts of San Mateo and San Francisco, for example, are very slopey. So this could occur where some of the existing small amounts of soil contaminants may not be an issue on the whole, but down at the bottom of that slope is where they're accumulating over time, right? So you want to make sure you're allowing for good water infiltration into the soil, especially if you're sloping, so you minimize erosion as well. Promote good drainage. Every so often you may need to aerate with a broad fork just to get some air and water in there into your soil. And then post-harvest, right? Vinegar has been shown. There's actual Cornell research recently released that suggests that white vinegar actually does act as a surfactant and can help remove particles from deeply veined leafy greens and root crops. So think about using vinegar as like a 10% solution when rinsing off your veggies, right? Especially in large sites or sites where you're just going to go to market, or you're going to make sure that your consumers are washing on the other side. And you can recommend they use a small percentage of vinegar themselves as well, right? And then peel your root crops. Don't forget to peel your root crops. That's another way to stay safe, especially only, again, if you've tested and you've got some level of soil contaminant concerns. Avoid waste-derived fertilizers. Read the package. More than anything else, just read the package. If you're going to use external inputs like fertilizers, read them, find out the way that they were processed, how they were created, and just do a little investigating or research on those processes. You may learn some things. You may think about whether you want to continue to use those products. So as far as site history, right, we already talked about getting your soil tested. And then based on that site history, you're going to ultimately do some investigation. You're going to find out what the site was before. Was it a dry cleaner? Was it a gas station? Was it a junkyard, right? There are these great maps called Sanborn Maps, and it used to be you would have to go to your local library to look them up. Nowadays, you can Google a link on the internet for Sanborn Maps, and they were insurance maps that were created from about the late 20s, early 30s, up until the mid to late 50s, and sometimes in some cases even later. And they really give a sense of what the land use was before. Was it an industrial factory that as the neighborhood changed, the land was sold and the area became a residential neighborhood over time? Was it a smelting plant? Was it some kind of an automobile-based industrial plant? So think about what the site history is, because that'll help you think about the kinds of chemicals you need to test for, right? They might indicate whether you need to test for mercury. Mercury, last time I checked a while back, testing for mercury in addition to your basics like lead, arsenic, and cadmium might add $50, $80, $100, $125 to the cost of one single soil sample test. So you can save a lot of money by doing this homework on the front end. And then think about remediation versus best practices, best management practices, right? How you manage your soil safely, how you manage your crops safely. There is a point at which if you're beyond threshold levels, your ability to manage soils and stay safe may be just not as realistic or reasonable to pursue. Just because there's small amounts of soil contaminants in the soil at or below threshold levels doesn't necessarily mean that they're being uptaken. That is a variable situation, and you won't know that either unless you get your crop tissues tested. There is some research to suggest that those dynamics are variable, most of that coming out of Cornell as well. You want to observe your plant growth, your soil organisms, if you have any worms, other insects, larvae, right? You want to dig in the soil, do some basic soil structure tests like those we described earlier on. You want to get to know your neighbors. Ask them what the property was before, right? Find out if the prior use of the property included a home that was built before 1978. Was the site a parking lot, a gas station, a concrete plant? Concrete plants have a history of releasing a lot of calcium salts into the air, often which were deposited on the ground over time. Again, was it an illegal dumping site, right? You are your best educator, observer, researcher, and investigator. Ask yourself, are there plants currently growing there? Is the soil compacted? Is the soil easy to dig into? Are you finding any of those organisms I mentioned, the worms, the insects, etc.? Do you run into PVC piping, rebar, batteries, whether tiny Duracell batteries or car batteries? And having worked in public housing in New York City, we would run into all sorts of things. Sometimes we would run into iron pipes in the ground when digging and prepping the soil. Consider doing a basic bean test and comparing it with some store-bought soil. See how the beans grow. Maybe do 10 or 20 of those in cups and do a comparison. Get your kids and families involved. You can actually have them do the calculations and run the percentages and help them understand what interpreting those results means for your family. Think about it. So in terms of food growing sites, you want to map your sites. You want to map your actual sample spaces, right? Areas that show differences in plant growth should be mapped differently. Areas that are near an older home built before 1978 or with some level of evidence of contamination based on the site history, you might want to map in a different way. Certainly, you're going to label your samples, right? You're going to keep accurate notations of where you took your samples and label those specifically in correlation to the bags of samples that you send into the lab, right? Each distinct area should be sampled. You're going to make some maps of your yard spaces, of your urban farm or community garden, school garden, faith-based site, therapeutic site, right? Based on the area, based on the site history, was it an older residential or commercial property? What are you seeing growing there? Make a couple of maps. First one of the vegetation and the general property itself. And then also where there's other stuff. Is there an old tool shed on the property where pesticides or various kinds of auto solvents and oils might have been stored, right? These are just some examples of urban farms. One in Richmond, this is the North Richmond Farm. Here's the West Oakland Urban Farm Park. And this was actually a brownfield before that was cleaned up over time and then turned into crops fields. And you can be sure that they noted that the soil test results got above the safe levels, right? That they were below thresholds. And so that all growing processes would be safe for local participants on the land. Think about what you need to get your soil samples taken, right? You need to gather the tools you need. You might need a ruler, some buckets, some quart-sized plastic Ziploc bags, some gloves, maybe some paper to make a map, right? A clipboard would be nice to keep it easy, a pen, pencil, right? You want an old spoon, one that you might not use for anything else in the future if you can. And then think about safety while sampling, right? If you are concerned about the potential for there being contaminants in the soil, you might want to think about certainly wearing gloves, but also, do you want to wear goggles? Do you need to wear a mask? Things to think about. So with that, Casey's going to go ahead and share screen and show a quick video, and I'm going to stop share. Thanks. Let's see here. Oops. There we go. Having a little mouse issue here. There we go. Okay. All right.
Scrape, so I'm going to use the spoon and I'm going to collect 1 spoonful from 3 sides of this hole. So I'm just going to use the spoon. I want to start all the way at the bottom and just carefully scrape up the side so that I'm getting soil from the entire 6 inches up to the surface. Then I'm going to put that spoonful in bag A and then do it again over here. So I moved over, so I did A there, I'm gonna do B over here. And you wanna make sure that the soil going into the spoon doesn't knock the rest of the soil off the spoon. And then, so if this was at 6, if I took A at 6 o'clock, then I maybe took B at 4:30, and then I'm gonna take C up here at 2 o'clock. And put it, whoops, that's bag A, so you don't want to accidentally put it back in bag A. You want to make sure that you're putting C into bag C. So
Each hole will have 3 bags.
each hole will have a spoonful that goes into bag A, B, and C.
So how many bags we get all together?
three
Just
bags
3?
from-
Yes, exactly. You get 3 of these gallon bags.
Of all those 30 holes that we're
Yes.
collecting.
All right. Thank you so much, Casey. All right, I'm going to reshare. All right, so what he was talking about with the A, B, and C, right? He's taking subsamples to create what's called a composite sample, okay? And hang on. There we go. Okay, so here's your hole, right? And let's say this is A, and that one was B, this was C, right? He had 3 different bags, and he had multiple holes. And what he was doing was he was taking from each so that he would have multiple subsamples and ultimately mix them together to create what's called a composite sample. And all of this is easily found and available instructions wise in the information that Casey will share in the resources list with links and information. But the idea here is you're trying to most efficiently get your soil tested to understand the health of your soil and whether contaminants are like lead are a concern, but also not overspend your money, right? Not do contaminant testing for contaminants that may not have any suggested evidence that they were on the site, right? Based on your research, based on your investigation, your own time spent getting a sense of what was on the site previously. So ultimately, you're going to send a composite sample. You might have multiple, 2 or 3, for example, on an 1/8 or a 1/4 of an acre, as just one set of examples that you send into a lab. But it'll also be based on what was on that site before. Okay, so here, I'm having some Wi-Fi. There we go. Okay, so this is, again, it's really, really important to map your soil samples, those bags that he was talking about as A, B, and C, right? This might be row 1, right? Where all the squares are all the A's, and that's 1 bag. And all the circles are all the C's, and that's another bag. And all the triangles are all the B's, and that's a 3rd bag, right? And he has taken from each of those squares in that top row and mixed them together so that he gets a smaller number of overall bags. And from that, he's going to draw what's called a composite sample to then send to the lab, right? Or for example, if you're not really concerned about the site history very much, you could do just 1 bag with small spoon amounts with subsamples from all of the squares in this image, for example, and send then a drawn composite from all of that to the lab. Just a small amount, right? Let's see. Okay, I'm going to use the mouse to scroll. Okay, so here's another example of the mapping effort related to getting your sample sites mapped. This image shows a couple things. One is on the left side, there was a history. That history included either a gas station or a dry cleaner. The property is south facing, but this home here, where there was a house and a patio, right, was built before 1978. And these bars here, these darker bars, are actually where you want to put in raised beds, right? But you're trying to get your local native, well, not native, but your local soil that you're going to grow in and potentially grow in ground in tested. So you're actually going to take, let's say we were to have this bar was the bag that we were going to send a composite sample to the lab with, right? Let's say this was 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, right? But ultimately you would send one composite sample from this. You might do a second one right next to the home because that home was built before 1978 and you want to have an understanding on what is in that soil and if lead is a particular concern, right? You might also do, you could take this whole set of 6 X's, right? And actually combine subsamples into one bag and draw a composite sample from them. But let's say that this particular square, like this whole thing is 1, 2, 3, and then the next one is 4, right? And this is 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D, 3E, 3F, right? Let's say this third box here comes up as having some level of soil contaminant concerns, right? You may want to test the rest of these as individual samples and have those sent to the lab. So that becomes more expensive because you're sending more samples to get tested, but you may not have anything, and so you've saved some money if that's not the case, right? So think about this in terms of this process and follow the soil sampling instructions as well. And you want to, at the very least, establish a relationship with your soil lab, right? Get to know the lab tech or the front desk receptionist if you're going to drop it off. You want to at least test for soil pH, percent organic matter, nutrients, and then at the very least of the heavy metals, I would say at least test for lead, maybe think about cadmium and arsenic too, and then think about whether you would want to test for petrochemicals and dioxins, right? It's all going to be based on the site history in particular as well, okay? Your sampling strategy is going to be based also on the site conditions and the kinds of crops or plants you're thinking about growing. The same also goes for ornamentals, right? If you're only worrying about a little bit of grass, then you might only test in the first 2 or 3 inches of the soil. But if you're actually sampling an urban farm site, you might actually do sampling from the top 6 to 12 or 6 to 18 inches, right? For either of them, you're going to make a composite sample. You're going to remove the subsample, and that's what you're going to send for testing. All right. And then in terms of sample preparation, right? You want to map your sample spots. That's the most important thing, so that when you get your test results back, that lab data sheet will say sample spot 1A, sample spot 3F, right? For example, and that way you can correlate what your sample spot had with whether or not there were any contaminants of concern, right? Like I said, you want to mix the subsamples for a composite sample and then draw out a composite subsample to send to the lab. You may need to dry the soil, but you may not. You may want to check in with your lab and find out what their suggested protocol is, right? And you may or may not want to mail your soil instead of dropping it off, depending on where the lab is that you're going to use. You might or might not have to sift your soil. In most cases, you will probably have to sift anything bigger than like a nickel out of your soil. Sometimes they'll do that for you. And then you want to ultimately send and deliver the send and or deliver the sample, right? Okay, in the process of getting your soil sampled, in urban areas where there may be a potential for concern about lead in the soil or contaminants in the soil, you want to moisten the soil as you're doing the sampling process, so that when you're crouching down, your head and face are closer to the soil, or you're bending down or bending your knees and you're close to the ground level, you are not necessarily inhaling soil if the soil blows in the wind and you get soil dust, right? So think about keeping your soil wet when actually pulling your soil samples. Now, this is a little bit different from more regional and peri-urban and larger scale commercial farming, where we often say, don't work wet soils because you can affect the soil quality. But in this case, this is for safety reasons, right? You might want to discard the first couple of inches of the soil. That may not be worth testing, could give you negligible results. On the other hand, if the site is near a highway or roadway and you're concerned, you could do so. But, you know, the more you test, the more it costs. So things to think about, right? again, remove anything that's twigs or small pebbles, rocks that's greater than about the size of a nickel. You want to mix your subsamples and then bag them, bag a drawn subsample. And don't forget to label, right? The date, the time, the part of the slope. If you're on a slope, is it the bottom of the slope? Are you noting that there's no particular vegetation growing on that particular spot? Some people that are soil scientists even like GPS that specific spot. And then use clean equipment, you know, even when using that spoon that I was mentioning earlier, right? Between the different sets of sampling, you should try to at least wipe that down a bit. If toxins are found, then you'll do additional testing. Don't worry, you will do that because you'll be motivated and encouraged to find out what the concern is, right? Especially if you have kids or family members that are growing food or could be tracking in soil particles. If you're growing shrubs or trees, you might be actually sampling from deeper down, but don't forget that woody trees and shrubs are less likely to uptake contaminants if there are any in the soil. The greater concern is actually soil dust, whereas your veg crops, you may have more concern to be aware of, right? And so, again, don't forget to map your soil sample spots, right? That can be one of the most important keys to understanding the soils in your ambient environment, and also whether you have contaminant concerns. You want to cut off the pathways by following the best practices, right? And if you're growing on a site where you have the public come through, you know, some urban farms are also your local botanical gardens, your local community center, neighborhood resilience center. I know under COVID, a lot of urban farm spaces became places where food distribution was taking place. But think about having a soil safety plan, right? If you've got soils where you've done the testing and you're below threshold levels, but you've got some level of lead there, for example, right? And you found that to be somewhat consistent throughout the site. Think about having a soil safety plan that you actually post, right? You want to share what the safe soil management practices that you're following are with your local constituency, especially if you've got volunteers on the site. Are you doing U-pick operations where they come and pick themselves? Are these things they should be aware of as well? Share why you're doing those management practices. It helps them to think about it. When they know why you're doing what you're doing, they're more likely to also do them if they're interacting with your soils and your crops on your site as well. And then inform new growers, you know, especially in community garden and school garden settings where you sometimes get new teachers or new volunteers growing food or new families growing food, letting them know why we're doing what we're doing and that we've gotten our soil tested and there's some reasons and rationale behind this actually helps them to stay informed and follow through on the practices as well, right? So with that, you know, we just want to thank you for being a part of this webinar. You know, UC Cooperative Extension in the Bay Area and in California has been around for about 100+ years in most of the counties of the state. And we want to support your efforts so that our communities can grow together. That's the bottom line. We're also in cooperation with our local county ag department in San Mateo County and in the Bay Area counties around the Bay as well. And then this is my contact info if I can be of further support in the future. Happy growing, and don't guess, but don't forget to get your soil tested. All right, thanks so much. Casey, I'm gonna pass the mic to you in case you have any thoughts or comments, and maybe we've got some Q&A. And how much time do we have left?
We have about 10 minutes. Thank you, Rob.
Yep.
And we do have a few questions. So there's two kind of, I think, from Mishwa about, one says, can you mention any natural soil contaminants such as from serpentine ridge soils like at Northridge?
Yes, you did get me, Mishwa. How are you today? So in certain parts of California and in particular certain parts of the peninsulas of the Bay, both the north and south, the San Francisco and Marin peninsulas in particular, some of the soils on some of the slopes have these sort of bluish colored striations that you can sometimes see even from a distance. And some of those soils are what are called serpentine soils. And serpentine soils have the potential to have natural asbestos in them. So you want to look for the signs of serpentine soils. We will include in the resources guide some fact sheets and tip sheets about serpentine soils. I have to remember to make sure that we get them out to community on a regular basis. And so that is something to be aware of. Thank you for asking that question, Misha.
Thanks, Rob. And I think there was a similar question, associated one from Mishwa about that she's on a serpentine ridge in Hunter's Point. It is composed of heavy metals containing asbestos. What are best procedures? But it sounds like you'll send out some information about that.
Yeah, well, I would say, in that particular case, because I'm a little familiar with Mishwa's site, you can really build up. You want to build raised planter boxes. Think about putting a landscape layer or maybe a thick layer of wood chips at the bottom of the planter boxes if they're deep planter boxes, especially those that are waist height. And actually, you want to import your soils and also make your own compost on the site to the degree you can as well. And try not to disturb the soils underneath. And keep the soil in general covered with mulches. And if you can in the pathways, either keep them covered with mulch as wood chips or even, grass is a good soil cover and reducer of soil dust also in the pathways.
Okay, we have a few more questions. There is one from Cecilia about their house having termites and recently being fumigated. And then I think they'll be doing a soil injection treatment, a very specific question, but they're wondering if you recommend getting, or where you would recommend getting information about the effects of these pesticides on soil health and fruit and vegetable crops grown in nearby soil, and how long after the treatment would it make sense to do a soil test?
Wow. Okay. So
and I don't know if we don't have a ton of time, but it might, if there's a lot of information to share, we could follow up with Cecilia offline too.
Yeah, Cecilia, I think we will follow up. There is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Andrew Sutherland, who's the Integrated Pest Management for UC Cooperative Advisor for UC Cooperative Extension. He is the Bay Area Urban IPM Advisor, and he centers around termites, bed bugs, and cockroaches work in various kinds of residential settings, including affordable housing and also educational settings like early childhood education facilities. And he would probably be among the better persons, if not the best person, not just in the Bay, but possibly the country, who could answer that question. I don't know a whole lot on the answer to that question, but I would be interested in learning what the response to that one might be as a starting point. I would also say follow the practices, continue to amend with compost on a regular basis, and to the degree possible, if pesticides are being injected for termites into the particular soils, think about not growing crops there as well.
And I just put his email in the chat. So the next question from Yolanda says, with composite site samples, how do you know what portion of the composite contains contaminants?
Right, so a composite sample is ultimately a mix of varying subsamples, right? And from that mix, you're gonna pull a subsample to then send that to the lab, right? So how will you know? Well, first of all, the lab testing equipment and reagents are quite sensitive. And so you're able to get some red flag through that testing process, and they will find small amounts if there are any. If you then get the test results back and it says box number 3C has some small amounts of for example, lead in it, you may want to do additional testing, and you won't know until you've done more testing to what degree it's a real concern unless that original test result suggests you're well above threshold levels and you really have more concerns to be had. So I wouldn't get overly worried until there's a need to be worried.
Okay, and I think one more, there were actually a few questions, some that I answered in the chat, one about any recommendations for where to get your soil tested. And I shared the link to the, there's the UC Master Gardeners from Santa Clara County put together a list of recommended local labs. And then a question about whether the webinar will be shared. And we will share this recording and the previous workshop recording. We'll send links out to all who registered. And
right.
then a question about from Mishwa, if there's any funding from the RCD to pay for soil testing and what soil testing company we recommend, and if any of those are local. And so the answer to the first question, yes, the RCD does actually have funding through this grant we have from the NACD, the National Association of Conservation Districts, to support urban ag producers in San Mateo and San Francisco counties with soil health assessments, soil testing, and then if there's any need to implement soil health practices like composting, mulching, we can also help pay for that. So Mishwa, maybe you and I can connect after this over email or set up a time to chat. And then as far as what soil testing company agency, depends on what you're testing for, but that list that I shared in the chat put together by the UC Master Gardeners from Santa Clara County is a great place to start. And most of those, or not most, some are local. So let's see, I think I don't see any other questions for now. Rob, is there anything you wanted to add?
Did you check the Q&A? There's a noted 4 questions in Q&A.
Yeah, I've gone through those.
Okay, sweet. Well, that's it for now. You know, keep in mind you want to grow food, family, and farm safely, and following best practices after you've gotten your soil test, with testing soil being the first of the best practices, right, is really the way to go. And soils in urban areas are pretty variable, even across a small site. So you can do more testing if you want at a later point, but as a starting point, do the base level of getting your soils tested. And we're happy to be a resource and be of support, and happy food growing to you and your communities.
Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Rob. I just added my email in the chat, and Rob's email is still up on the slide. So make sure to write those down. And you can also find them pretty easily on our various websites. But yeah, reach out if you have any questions or want to chat further about anything that we covered tonight.
And if you grow food beyond your own personal or family needs in San Mateo or San Francisco, we would love to come out and be a resource and check out your sites and be of support. So don't hesitate to reach out as well. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Take care. We're gonna stop the share. Oops.
And then stop recording.
You got that part?